Welcome back to the Ready for Merge show hosted by yours truly, Christine D. Kim. This is your first bi-weekly brief on Bitcoin and Ethereum protocol development of 2026. Happy New Year, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. I hope everyone had a really good holiday break. Mine's was honestly extremely hectic and chaotic. Some for reasons that I knew beforehand and others that were just totally unexpected. So I'm I had been like looking forward to coming back, doing this show, doing all my newsletters, and just getting back into the routine of work because I felt as though that would actually be slower. I don't know if anyone else feels like coming back from the holidays feels like you're coming back to a slower rhythm and not actually like you're winding down, like coming back to work um than the opposite. Which yeah, reminded me or made me think like I truly did not. I might have overdone it this holiday season. But anyways, I hope everyone else had a bit more of a relaxing holidays. And even if you did it and it was really in your holidays, it was really busy like mine. Um, at least it's over. And now the new year has begun. Um, let's get into the topics that we're going to talk about today for the first biweekly brief of the year. For today's show, we are going to get started with Ethereum updates today. And the main one is on a network-wide upgrade that happened just a few hours ago. It happened yesterday at 8 p.m. Eastern time. And it was the kind of like the final step of the Fusaka upgrade that went live last year. But that upgrade was really an upgrade of a bundle of three different upgrades that would happen in a gradual way. So the first two, the Fusaka upgrade itself, and then BPO1 went live last year, and the third and final kind of step of the upgrade happened yesterday. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about what code changes were activated and what changed about the Ethereum protocol since yesterday. And I do want to make a brief note on some breakout meetings that I hope will just help my listeners that are just interested in getting a bit deeper in tracking Ethereum development. I just want to give some heads up about some changes to the meeting schedule, the developer meeting schedule coming up over these next couple weeks. This is relevant to kind of understanding what to be watching for, and I'll give you some tips on how I kind of track and prioritize what I'm looking for when it comes to tracking the evolution of Ethereum. So that's really on the Ethereum side. And then on the Bitcoin side, I want to talk about soft forks, three soft forks in particular that maybe you didn't know were discussed and are still being discussed, have been being discussed since the holidays and are continuing to being discussed in the Bitcoin community right now. And it's interesting because soft forks are pretty different from most of the kinds of code merges that happen for the Bitcoin protocol. Most of the Bitcoin code merges for Bitcoin Core are all non-consensus related. They don't impact really the core of how the Bitcoin protocol works. But soft forks do introduce new functionality. It does change consensus. And so the fact that there are three that are being discussed on the stage of like how do we activate them is kind of interesting. And I don't want anyone to be alarmed. It's not likely that Bitcoin is going to soft fork anytime soon. But it is interesting that there's just a few already that we're kicking off the year with, and a bit of drama related to them that I think is interesting. So yes, it's going to be a jam-packed episode, and let's get into it. Let's dive right in. I'm going to do a little timestamp for any of my listeners that really slouching a little bit. I'm going to do a little timestamp here for my listeners that want to know exactly when the Ethereum updates get started on the show. Um, So yeah, let's dive first into the Ethereum updates. The first one is, of course, as I mentioned, the Blob Parameter Only hard fork went live yesterday at yesterday evening at 8 p.m. Eastern time. And basically, what the upgrade did is it increased blob capacity by 40%. So, by scaling blob capacity, the Ethereum protocol is trying to evolve in such a way that more L2s can operate on Ethereum. These alternative these like additional layers, these additional protocols that can help reduce kind of like the burden of transaction execution and processing, and can help more users onboard to Ethereum, but through kind of these alternative protocols. So by increasing blob capacity, it should make it more there should be more room for layer twos, basically. And the blob parameter only hard fork that went live yesterday basically increased the blob target. So the number of blobs that um, on average will get included in an Ethereum block from 10 blobs to 14. And it increased the maximum of blob numbers to 21 per block. And the dynamics around the pricing for these blobs and how the capacity fluctuates from the target to the maximum number of 21. It's very similar to the way that just regular transactions get included into an Ethereum block, which I don't have time to get into in today's episode, and I'm going to try to be better this year about going into deep rabbit holes. But if you're interested, it's the dynamics are pretty clearly laid out in EIP and Ethereum Improvement Proposal EIP 1559. When this increase happened, it's a pretty significant increase, 40% of increase to blob capacity. Good news is that there wasn't any noticeable network disruptions. There weren't any concerns around network health. It appears as though the increase went fine. I even saw a tweet by one of the Ethereum developers saying this was the first hard fork that they slept through. So that's good. One kind of aftermath of this protocol change is that there was a noticeable spike in the cost for blobs on Ethereum. It appears that there had been some layer twos that were waiting for this increase before starting to submit their blobs, and the demand, the number of blobs that were being submitted to Ethereum were larger than even the increased capacity. Than even the space, like the 14 blobs per block target could handle. And so blob fees did dynamically adjust upwards. And so there was a spike in blobs. But before the show, I was checking out exactly, how high that spike was. And in dollar terms, it still wasn't too crazy. Before the blob capacity increase yesterday, blobs were virtually costless, did not really cost anything in dollar terms. But due to the spike, blob transactions started to cost a few cents. So that increase was definitely noticeable in like percentage terms, but when it comes to just like the operational expenses of like submitting blocks to Ethereum and operating the L2, it's still quite cheap on Ethereum, which is a good sign, which is good, and that's what Ethereum developers want. And block fees have since stabilized, even though they are definitely still elevated from what the blob fees used to be before these blob capacity increases were activated through the Fusaka fork. And as I mentioned, this is the third and the final blob capacity increase related to Fusaka. There were two that happened. One of the BPO1 happened last year. BPO2 went live yesterday. And developers, they are doing a bunch of analysis on the network now to consider, okay, what further blob capacity increases should be scheduled and should be done in the months forthcoming. And to this, there was some pretty interesting analysis on the impact of BPO1. And I thought this analysis has been was pretty interesting, and I want to mention it on the show. There's an ETH research post that dives into more of the details around this, which I'll link into the show notes of today's episode if you're interested. It was done by a researcher at a blockchain. I think it's a research company called Chainbound, and for any of you that already know this person on X, their handle is mempirate. Um, but they had a post and shared some analysis showing that the higher blob counts are actually resulting in consistently worse latency for validators on Ethereum and consistently worse attestation performance. And they were suggesting in their post some changes to the types of nodes on Ethereum, um, particularly super nodes on Ethereum that custody all blobs. And basically review all the data in all the blobs, which not all nodes have to do anymore from the Fusaka upgrade, due to the Fusaka upgrade. Um, and it just goes to show that there might be some aftermath effects of Fusaka and the blob capacity increases that developers hadn't quite anticipated, and will need to introduce potentially some fixes for in the next hard fork. Um, so something to continue to keep a watch on and a close eye on, these kind of medium term impacts and effects after fork, how it changes network dynamics, and as Mem Prior was pointing out, potentially some negative impacts on node performance. Um, Following these blob capacity increases that should be taken into account even when developers start considering, well, what further increases can we do now that the first two BPOs have gone live on Ethereum? And though they hadn't, these BPO increases hadn't really indicated any disruptions on like network stability, there appears to have been some there appears to be evidence to show that it's actually negatively impacting validator performance. One other topic that I wanted to mention on the Ethereum side, aside from the BPO2 fork and some of the interesting kind of takeaways on the BPO2 fork, is that there is just kind of continued planning and coordination around the next Ethereum upgrade, which is going to be called the Glamsterdam upgrade. And there's a couple of changes coming to how developers plan for Glamsterdam. And main change that I want to mention is kind of a change to the meeting topics. So there is, for any of my listeners that don't know, there is kind of a central forum called the All Core Developers Calls that Ethereum protocol developers gather on a weekly basis. It's twice weekly on Monday and on Thursday to discuss the code changes that are going to be activated on Ethereum. But for Ethereum, there's so many code changes, and oftentimes there's just so much to discuss that there are kind of dedicated breakout meetings for important topics that require dedicated discussion. And for most of last year, the dedicated discussion that was happening to implement and to develop and to test the two biggest features of Glamsterdam, which is enshrined proposer builder separation and block level access lists. They had their own dedicated breakout meetings, EPBS and balls. But starting from this month, the topics and the discussions for EPBS and balls are actually going to move into the ACD calls, particularly the Monday ACD calls. And developers are going to start sharing updates and discuss testing around these features directly on the Monday calls. That's important to know because number one, for anyone who was tracking kind of these breakout meetings, if you see that it's not on the Ethereum protocol calendar, there's a Ethereum protocol calendar where all of the protocol related meetings are shared. And if you notice that, EPBS doesn't have one for the next for this year, or that none of the meetings are showing up, it's not because developers are not talking about these protocol changes. It's just that they're doing it in a forum and uh, in a setting where now more developers are going to be involved in their implementation. Um, and that's really how it goes. The ACD calls, there's three in terms of Ethereum development. There's three ACD calls. There's ACD testing, there's ACD consensus, and there's ACD execution. And while there's some views that the difference between these calls and the kind of topics that are discussed, one is more execution layer focused code changes, and one's more consensus layer code changes. In practice, the real difference is visibility. The all core developer execution calls is the call that generally more developers, protocol developers, engage with than the consensus layer calls. And then for the consensus layer calls, the consensus layer calls are more engaged with, more actively, there's more active participants in them than the testing calls. And so when it comes to decision making, oftentimes the testing calls will just be a place for updates to be shared, and any decisions will kind of be relayed over to the consensus or execution layer calls. And if there's a big decision that needs to be made on the consensus layer call, then that decision will often be discussed or reiterated most definitely at the very least reiterated on the execution layer call. And there had been discussions about, well, maybe we should increase the types of ACD calls that we have. There is some discussion around that happening in the Ethereum community right now. But I truly think that when it comes to the way that these calls are being used, the difference in the ACD calls is really not about topic. It's really about visibility. Um, and and so introducing say the main topic is whether or not there should be an ACD governance call, just to talk about governance related topics. I don't think that that will be that would really change much. The difference between the ACD calls is really about visibility, and adding an additional call, a fourth ACD call, will only kind of dilute, I guess, even more the visibility between. I guess if you add like another fourth call, then maybe that call will just be even more minor updates shared that are then reiterated on the other three calls. So it just becomes a longer and longer, I guess, how I should say, like telephone line, because that's already how the three ACD calls work. So yeah, I mentioned this for any listeners because it's useful for understanding kind of like how to track governance and how to track Ethereum development. And so some of this is just useful information to know about tracking development this year. So you should know that for Amsterdam scoping, almost 99% of it is now going to happen directly on the ACD calls. And I cover the ACD calls very closely via my newsletters, and I always mention updates from it on this show. But I don't really spend a lot of time on the breakout calls because the breakout calls are generally talking about topics that are going to be not that are potentially a bit farther out in Ethereum's development roadmap. For any listeners that are interested in understanding more really the longer term roadmap for Ethereum development and where the ball is heading for Ethereum development, I would highly recommend tracking specific breakout calls that are focused on code changes that could be implemented in the hard fork after Amsterdam. So there's one primary one that I think is going to be interesting for listeners that just want to learn more about Ethereum and maybe prioritize. If you're already tracking the ACD calls, already getting a lot of the information from my newsletter or the show, but you want to dive a little bit deeper or look a little bit longer term Ethereum's developer roadmap. I highly recommend the breakout calls that happen related to the code changes that could get into the fork after Glamstrom. And that's the H star fork, which was renamed right before the holidays, but I can't quite remember what that name was. It used to be Heka, but I know they changed that. The first breakout meeting that is related to an H star code change is fossil inclusion lists that are related. It's a feature that is designed to strengthen Ethereum censorship resistance. And another breakout meeting that is likely to get organized for a code change that could go into H star potentially, that was discussed on the recent ACD call very briefly, but was again punted to potentially just discussing it on a breakout call, is EIP 7745. And this is a proposal that could make verifying what happens on Ethereum on chain bit more trustless. Doesn't require the help of, or like the necessity of going through a third party provider, like a data provider or an infra provider. And yeah, developers, due to limited time on these ACD calls, they had decided, well, for this discussion on this EIP, since it could potentially go into the next fork, perhaps a dedicated breakout meeting will be a better venue for it. Another major code change that is being discussed for the H star fork is shortening block time, 6-second block times. Now, this code change doesn't have a breakout meeting yet, but I have high confidence that one will be created for it if there's enough support for it going into the H star fork. Breakout meetings are kind of these venues where a lot of community discourse and support for a code change can be discussed in advance, and with enough popularity and enough kind of like visibility on these breakout calls. Eventually, the idea is that these breakout calls start to become encapsulated, or the topics on the breakout calls start to become the topics of the ACD calls, which is exactly what is going to happen with EPBS and ball breakouts. And practically, just to end this Ethereum update, the EPBS updates will start to be shared on the ACD testing calls as soon as, I believe, this upcoming Monday. For the block level access list breakout calls, I noticed that there is actually one more scheduled next week. But after that, I believe all the block level access list updates will start to get into and be discussed on the all core developers testing calls. So something to be aware of. You may hear more EPBS and balls updates on the show now that I'll probably be hearing it on the ACD calls. Without further ado, let's talk about Bitcoin updates now and the important code changes that are being discussed on the Bitcoin protocol development side. I had taken a break for 2 weeks from Ethereum and from Bitcoin, tracking Bitcoin development. I come back and it appears everybody wants to fork Bitcoin. I am exaggerating a little bit. Of course, it's not everyone, but the talk of the town is these 3 soft fork proposals that are being actively discussed for activation. One of them is actually already in the process of happening. This is the soft fork proposal by a individual who calls themselves Dathan Ohm. The very little is kind of mysteriously known about Dathan. They entered the Bitcoin Core development discourse during the V30 controversy. Which was the controversial kind of release of Bitcoin Core that uncaps the data carrier size and simply allows more flexibility in terms of non-financial use cases for Bitcoin. And Dathan was on the side of many Bitcoin nuts supporters that actively argue against any kind of code change that could encourage non-financial use cases of Bitcoin. And now they have, and they recently released a couple of days ago, a alternative Bitcoin client that can be run that temporarily enforces a soft fork enforces these limits on the amount of data, that arbitrary data that can be included in a Bitcoin transaction on a consensus level, and does so for a temporary period of time, just to block and to completely stop users and dissuade users from trying to use Bitcoin for non-monetary purposes. Now, this is a version of Bitcoin that I don't think many people will adopt. And hence, I don't think there will be really any noticeable change in the Bitcoin protocol or disruption in the network. It's simply an attempt at forking Bitcoin into a version that Dathan and others believe is the better version of Bitcoin. And that is ongoing. Those efforts are ongoing. There's been quite a bit of controversy and discourse around it in the Bitcoin community. There's also a discussion about how to activate via soft fork BIP 119. Which would enable covenants. And covenants are basically just spending conditions on Bitcoin, BIP 119, and it would enable more expressive constraints on how Bitcoin can be spent on chain. And there was a meeting in December, I think mid-December, about how to activate BIP 119. And the meeting participants were very clear. They don't want to do it in the style that Dathan has moved forward with his BIP 110 is called. And they were saying that the way that Dathan is sharing this alternative client implementation is far too aggressive, and it's never going to win over the Bitcoin community. So let's try and activate BIP 119 with a more conservative approach. That's detailed in Bitcoin Improvement Proposal 9, that leaves plenty of time. I think it was a year for Bitcoin node operators, be it users or miners, to express support for this soft fork, and doesn't have any negative consequences, even if there is a lack of sufficient support. So I think the threshold was something like 75% of Bitcoin nodes need to actively support the fork for its features to go live. So there was that meeting, and I haven't seen too much discussion on the BIP 119 activation method since the meeting happened, but I do believe that this is a conversation that there's going to be some follow-up on it in the next couple of weeks, because the idea was that the soft fork for BIP 119 in this proposal hopefully would start getting the ball rolling on actually a version of Bitcoin that would enable that like 1 year runway period, and that would allow node operators on Bitcoin to really show or express their support for BIP 119. So kind of interesting, something to keep an eye out for. And third, last but not least, there is continued discussion on the BIP 54 proposal, which is sometimes called the Great Consensus Cleanup. BIP 54 introduces several different safeguards for making Bitcoin transaction validation rules more safe and predictable, and resistant to denial of service attacks. These are a bundle of different consensus level changes that simply address long known kind of edge cases in Bitcoin protocol. And there's a new version of the BIP that was shared right before the holidays, and is being tested on the Bitcoin testnet Signet. And the champion for this BIP, Antoine, was sharing earlier this year. I think it was actually like on New Year's Day, on the Bitcoin developers mailing list, that he was addressing just remaining concerns about the proposal and just keeping the ball rolling on trying to get this BIP ready for activation. So lots of soft fork, lots of BIPs that would need to be activated via soft fork. A lot of discussions, and the thing is, when you think about all these discussions, you could think, oh wow, like Bitcoin's really going to change a ton. They're going to have so many soft forks this year. but that's really kind of the wrong takeaway because it's still not clear whether any of these soft forks are really going to even happen this year. For Bitcoin, it takes such a long time for the protocol to actually change. The last soft fork that happened on Bitcoin was back in 2021 that activated the Taproot upgrade. And that took maybe like 4+ years of discussion for Taproot to really get to a place of activation. And now BIP54 and BIP119 are both soft fork proposals that have been being discussed since 2019. So when you think about the calendar, that's like 7 years. And so maybe they really are ready and it is time to activate them. But as I can tell by the discourse around them, there's still consensus that lacks for these BIPs. All of the concerns, all of the debates and discussions around them have not resulted in kind of like a clear decision that yes, they will get activated. There's merely just more like talk and trying to keep the ball and supporters trying to keep the ball rolling on these proposals to keep them in the discourse, but not yet a clear consensus for them. And BIP 110, the one by Dathan, that's a BIP that was just simply, I think it was drawn up over the holidays. Sure, there were conversations about it since the V30 controversy, the Bitcoin Core V30 release that went out in October of last year. But as a BIP that is comparatively to BIP 54 and BIP 119 extremely new in terms of its ideation and development, and also in terms of the style in which the BIP 119, the BIP 110 proposal is being pushed for, with an alternative Bitcoin client implementation already. I think it's clear that there's really no chance that it's going to impact the actual Bitcoin network or protocol in any way. Yeah, I get the sense that BIP 110 has already reached the end of the extent of its impact has already been seen, and that is just a controversy rather than actual consensus in the Bitcoin community. And hence, because all code changes for Bitcoin and Ethereum require consensus to really change the protocol. If there's no consensus, then the protocol doesn't change. So yes, if there's any takeaway from this, it really is that for meaningful protocol changes to happen on both Bitcoin and Ethereum, patience is key. Developers that are pushing for various features in either Bitcoin or Ethereum, it requires just a lot of consistency over potentially years. um, it's a marathon, not a sprint. So there you have it. That is the update on Bitcoin and Ethereum protocol development. You are now officially caught up on what's ready for merge in Bitcoin and Ethereum. Thank you for listening to this episode. If you're interested in anything that I talk about today and just want to follow up on some of these topics, because they are quite technical, I have some links in the show notes that will direct you to more information on them. I also write about these code changes in more detail on my Substack. So please do go check that out. I hope that for my listeners, whether you're 101 or like 500 level in terms of your knowledge of protocol development, I'm hoping that over time with these shows, like you'll become as an expert as I am, through just being immersed in the protocol discourse of these two protocols. Uh, that's the goal with these shows. So I hope the show notes help, but if there's anything else that I can do with these shows to just make it even more helpful and more accessible to you, please do share some feedback. I'm always open to feedback and just engaging with you. So wherever you're getting this podcast, be it you're listening in on it live right now or you are getting a recording of it, please do engage. If you like the episode, be sure to like it. If you think it'll be helpful for another friend, share it. And if you want to be notified of when new episodes drop, please do be subscribed. And speaking of new episodes, I want to note that next week's episode is going to be a guest episode. It's not going to be a live episode or a biweekly brief like today's. It's going to feature a pretty cool guest. I don't want to say who it is just yet because I'm actually doing that recording later today. And until I have done the episode, I don't want to jump the gun and announce it before it's recorded. But rest assured, it's going to be in either way, that it's going to be a meet the dev style interview, which I've done meet the dev style interviews before on the show. Most all of them have been from the Substack vault. But I'm going to try and do a recorded new one this week. And if it goes well, you'll see it next week, next Wednesday. And if it doesn't, you'll still get a Meet the Dev style interview from the Substack vault that features just a deep dive into the work and the background of a full-time protocol developer. So yeah, so stay tuned for that episode. And I hope everyone has a really good week. Thanks again for tuning in, and I'll talk to you all again next time.